My pleasure tonight to welcome the Anna Lind Professor of Global Policy at the Kennedy School, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for her book, Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, and the author of tonight's book, Chasing the Flame, biography of Sergio Vera de Mello. I hope you'll all join me in welcoming tonight Samantha Power. So we were discussing before that sort of new at the interview format, so I think my opening question is just, I think a lot of people, where we were just talking about time to read, a lot of people may not have read the book yet. Maybe you can open just by discussing who Sergio Vera de Mello was, how you got to know him, and why you chose to write this biography.
Great, thank you. Thanks for coming out on for our first really beautiful spring night. Sergio was somebody who was introduced to me in 1994 when I was a rookie reporter in Bosnia as a UN official who was a cross between James Bond on the one hand and Bobby Kennedy on the other. Which is not a bad combination for a UN guy. Young girl in the war zone looking for James Bond and Bobby Kennedy in one person. I thought, this guy's going to teach me things. And he was Bond-like in that he chased the flame. He was like a moth to the flame in terms of all the major conflicts of my lifetime, probably most of the major conflicts of all of yours. I mean, he was everywhere over the course of the last 40 years. He started off as a Brazilian son of a diplomat, moving with his father to the Middle East, to Italy, to Germany, to Spain, to Argentina as a boy. His father got forced into early retirement from the foreign ministry because the military took over in a coup in the mid-60s, and his dad was forced into an early retirement. He joined the UN at 21, Sergio did, and basically he was like Zelig. In wherever the world's headlines moved, he moved with them. So in the 70s, those were wars of decolonization and independence. He was in Bangladesh for the largest ever population movement at that time, 2 million people displaced, trying to figure out how to shelter them. He was in Sudan when the civil war there, it looked like it was ending. Sadly, it would resume, of course, as we know today. He was in Cyprus when the Turks invaded there. He was in Mozambique, dealing with the influx of fighters and refugees from what was then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. One of the most important missions was 1981 to 83. He was in southern Lebanon with the UN, dealing, one of the most impossible missions with Palestinians staging raids out from behind UN bases, the UN base, I should say, and then Israel responding by invading southern Lebanon, going all the way to Beirut, trampling the UN base in its path. Sergio, famous to all who've heard of Sergio, all 6 people who'd ever heard of Sergio before, goes charging up to this Israeli tank captain and says, "What you have done is unacceptable." This was back when Sergio was the full flower of youth and idealism. And the tank captain looks at him and says, unacceptable. You think this is unacceptable? I got 50 tanks behind me and they're following. Now that will be unacceptable. And Sergio said from that point forward he would never use the word unacceptable again. And it's an important moment because what he was, again, in this Bond-like way, was he was trying to fix things, but he was putting himself in these incredibly dangerous situations, and initially he thought the way you fix things in those places was you held up the principles, the UN laws and norms. And then later, with that moment or with that mission, I think, changed and began to think about how to actually make states think differently about their own self-interest, about incentives and disincentives and so forth. So, again, briefly, he then leaves Lebanon. The wall falls in '89. He's the guy charged with going and negotiating with the Khmer Rouge, figuring out how to negotiate the return of 400,000 Cambodians who had been displaced from Khmer Rouge territory. That's its own nightmare. I mean, how do you deal with people who've killed 2 million people before you got there? Do you bring up their crimes in the negotiation, or do you kind of bracket them and hope that they'll go away, the crimes and the criminal mindset. He did the latter. When I met him in Bosnia, he was known as Serbio, not Sergio, Serbio, because he'd gone so far in negotiating with killers. When nation building was all the rage in the late 90s, he was the Paul Bremer figure in charge of running both Kosovo and East Timor. And then, most tragically, in keeping with his Zelig-like persona, when it came time for President Bush to try to mend fences with the Europeans and with others who'd been alienated in the run-up to the war in Iraq, the U.S. called on the UN to send an envoy to Iraq in the summer of 2003, just after the invasion. Kofi Annan decided that he had to send his best because the Americans would probably not listen to the best the UN had to offer, but they certainly wouldn't listen to any mid-level UN official. So they took this guy who was Bobby Kennedy-like, because he was not just an idealist, but a Machiavellian idealist. He learned how to work with state power. And Kofi decided that the only person who could make an impression on the Americans at a time where they felt things were going well in Iraq, amazingly, it's hard to remember that, but in May and June of 2003, it was mission accomplished, which is now a sort of parody of premature gloating. But at the time, what it meant was Bush felt he didn't need anybody's advice. And yet Kofi Annan felt that the UN was being so marginalized, having been trampled in the run-up to the war itself. But also here was all this technical expertise of the kind Sergio possessed, how to deal with killers, how to deal with sectarianism, how to do nation building, how to do reconstruction, policing, transitional justice, elections, constitution. These were not skills that the United States had. And Kofi's view was, even though the UN had been trampled, metaphorically, not physically, as it had been in Lebanon, but that better to send the very best who would have answers to those questions, because at some point, deep down in the UN psyche and in the psyche of the technocrats was the recognition that the American success in war probably wouldn't last, and if it didn't last, it would be Iraqis who paid the price. So for me, back to your question, that's just a basic introduction to the guy, but the fact that one person could have been in all these places and then that he could die so tragically, and maybe we'll talk about his death, his shocking death, and shocking non-rescue of this invaluable civil servant, but that the insights he could have gleaned in all of these missions, the idea that they could die with him under the rubble, was so horrifying to me, given, I think, maybe you all share my feeling. A lot of people seem to share the feeling that we don't know what we're doing currently in the world, or at least we don't know what we're doing sufficiently. So here was someone who got this 34-year head start in violent places, thinking about how to deal with brokenness and how to deal with killers. And we'd never bothered to ask him what his views were, and so someone had to. And I wish the book had existed. I wouldn't have made my monster comment because I would have been more rested. But so, having said something so stupid, I find myself with a very passive-aggressive relationship now to this book. But I wish. I mean, I just think that it's less about the book and more about the crossroads that we're at as a country and needing to dip into some learning. And the fact that it comes in the form of a Bond-like figure who's got a woman in every port and who's very funny and self-critical and prickly and interesting, to me, he's a really, I feel blessed, to have got to walk in his footsteps, because he's a Trojan horse, I think, like none other for this time, this moment in our country's history.